Fraser McNair ruled the shadows, Isla Dunbar orchestrated chaos, and Camden Moss betrayed them both. Scotland's criminal underworld was never ready for what came next. In the early 2000s, as Glasgow's skyline transformed with modern architecture and commercial revival, a silent force was growing beneath the surface. In a world far removed from the polished offices and trendy cafes, a man named Fraser McNair was building something dark, methodical, and untouchable. Fraser wasn't born a criminal. He worked on the docks, known for being efficient, quiet, and unusually observant. But as he watched crates move in and out of the country, he began to understand the hidden economy flowing through Scotland's ports. Goods that could disappear, change hands, and reappear miles away, all without a single record. Fraser didn't want a piece of this world. He wanted to own it. He started small. A missing container here, a rerouted shipment there. He recruited 2 old friends, men he trusted not because they were loyal, but because they were predictable. Predictability, Fraser believed, was more valuable than trust. They used abandoned warehouses outside Inverclyde, storing electronics, laptops, cameras, even rare tech not yet released in the UK. These goods were sold through a network of small businesses in Edinburgh and Dundee, mostly pawnshops and repair centres. The transactions were so clean that law enforcement didn't notice for years. Fraser called his growing network the Black Lock Syndicate, though the name never appeared in writing or in conversation. It was whispered, implied, and for many, never confirmed. His genius wasn't in brute strength, but in invisibility. Where other gangs used muscle and mayhem, Fraser used timing and silence. Every movement was mapped out weeks in advance. He paid off disgruntled workers, bribed low-level customs agents, and even hired university students to create fake invoices and import records. Each job had layers of deniability. If anything went wrong, no one could trace it back to him. By 2004, the Black Lock Syndicate controlled a significant share of the underground import market. But Fraser wasn't interested in just electronics. He had his eyes on a more lucrative, riskier trade, narcotics. Through contacts in Amsterdam and Eastern Europe, Fraser began importing high-grade heroin and cocaine, hidden inside legal shipments of textiles and machinery. The drugs would be repackaged in quiet homes around Lanarkshire, then distributed across Scotland through a network of middlemen who never met Fraser directly. Violence was rare, almost unnecessary. Competitors either went bankrupt trying to match Fraser's prices or vanished after receiving quiet warnings. On the rare occasion that someone refused to cooperate, a single car accident or a home burglary gone wrong would send a message. No one could prove anything. Fraser believed in removing threats, not making statements. His closest associates, like Camden Moss, respected him more out of fear than admiration. Fraser kept everyone at a distance. He never stayed in one house. For too long, his phone changed every month. He had no known family and no social media presence. If you asked people about Fraser McNair in 2005, most would say they'd never heard of him. Those who had would lower their voices, unsure if even saying his name might draw attention. The Black Lock Syndicate expanded further into laundering, using local casinos and car dealerships to wash illegal money. Fraser also began investing in legitimate businesses, construction, transport, logistics. These became shields and camouflage for the darker operations behind them. Government audits never found anything. Even whistleblowers lacked the evidence to prove a connection. It wasn't long before other gangs started noticing. Groups in Aberdeen and Inverness were either pushed out or forced to pay Fraser for protection. Even the notorious Dunbar Pact, known for their brutal tactics, began losing ground in key areas. But while others ruled with blood and fire, Fraser ruled with calm and precision. He didn't need the streets to know his name. All he needed was for his shipments to keep moving and his enemies to keep guessing. By the end of 2006, the Black Lock Syndicate had grown from a dockside operation to a nationwide empire. Fraser McNair had created something Scotland had never seen before, a criminal network that didn't just operate in the shadows, but had become part of the shadows themselves. There were no flashy cars, no gang colors, no public shootings. There was only silence, strategy, and a man who understood that the greatest power was the kind no one ever saw coming. The authorities were aware of strange patterns, vanishing shipments, sudden wealth among low-level businessmen, and whispers of a mysterious figure behind it all. But without names, witnesses, or evidence, they had nothing. Fraser McNair had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. His empire was growing, and Scotland had no idea that a new kind of underworld was quietly taking control. While Fraser McNair built a silent empire through precision and invisibility, another force was rising in the granite city of Aberdeen, one that thrived on chaos, fear, and open dominance. It was a gang that didn't care for strategy or silence. They wanted control, respect, and total submission. This was the Dunbar Pact, a brutal collective led by three siblings, Callum, Isla, and Rory Dunbar. The Dunbars came from a broken home in the heart of Aberdeen. Their father was a known enforcer in the 1980s, killed in a bar stabbing that was never solved. Their mother was absent, more interested in her addictions than her children. By the time the siblings were teenagers, they had already been arrested multiple times for theft, assault, and drug possession. But what made them dangerous wasn't their violent upbringing. It was their absolute loyalty to each other and their shared desire for power. Callum, the eldest, was the muscle. Built like a cage fighter and feared for his temper, he handled confrontations personally. Isla, calm and cold, was the strategist. She handled the money, the planning, and the contacts. Rory, the youngest, was the recruiter and enforcer in training, eager to prove himself in every violent encounter. Together they created a gang that ruled by force and left no room for negotiation. The Dunbar Pact started with protection rackets in the pubs and clubs of Aberdeen. If a bar owner refused to pay, bottles would fly through windows, staff would be attacked, or worse. They moved into drug dealing quickly, pushing cocaine and ecstasy at music festivals, nightclubs, and university campuses. Their main distributors were local youths, many drawn in by the promise of quick money and street respect. Unlike Fraser McNair's network, which worked in silence, the Dunbar Pact made their presence known. They wanted people to fear their name. They wanted the city to know that the streets belonged to them. Their signature was brutality. A nightclub stabbing that left 6 dead, a car bombing that shattered shop windows for blocks, a home invasion that ended in a fiery explosion. These weren't just crimes, they were messages. What made the Dunbars even more dangerous was their ability to protect themselves legally. Isla ensured that every layer of their operation was shielded through shell companies and bribed officials. Callum built a loyal army, paying generously and punishing betrayal with merciless beatings or forced disappearances. Rory kept the gang growing by luring in young, desperate men who were willing to do anything to feel powerful. By 2007, the Dunbar Pact controlled a vast portion of Aberdeen's criminal activity. Their influence spread through the northeast, extending into Inverness and even down toward Dundee. The police knew who they were, but could do little to stop them. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence mysteriously vanished. Raids turned up nothing or were never approved. The city was paralyzed by fear, and the Dunbars took full advantage of that. It wasn't long before their expansion caught the attention of other criminal networks. A turf war was inevitable. The first signs of conflict came quietly. A Dunbar supplier found murdered in Edinburgh, a shipment of their drugs seized in Glasgow under suspicious circumstances. Then, more bodies. A fire in a warehouse, a missing courier, a drug house ransacked with no trace of the attackers. The Dunbars were under attack, but they couldn't see the enemy. There were no messages, no retaliation demands, just damage. What the Dunbars didn't know was that Fraser McNair had silently declared war. One of their dealers had attempted to move product into Glasgow without permission. That mistake triggered a quiet campaign of sabotage orchestrated by the Black Lock Syndicate. Fraser didn't want a fight. He wanted to dismantle them piece by piece, silently, and from within. Callum responded the only way he knew how, with fury. He tightened control over their street-level dealers, doubled their security, and started sending warnings to anyone he suspected of betrayal. Isla began, tracing financial records, trying to identify how their money was being disrupted. Rory, eager to prove himself, led a retaliatory strike against a suspected Black Lock contact, killing 3 people in a pub brawl. But none of it worked. The more they reacted, the more they lost. The syndicate's silence was suffocating. The Dunbar Pact, known for their dominance, was now on the defensive. For the first time, they felt outmatched. As the hidden war escalated, both empires began to crumble in places they couldn't see. Trust inside the Dunbar ranks began to falter. Allies became informants. Soldiers vanished without trace. And somewhere, in the middle of it all, Isla Dunbar started asking herself if there was a better way, one that didn't involve Callum's rage or Fraser's shadows. It was a thought she kept to herself. For now. By 2013, the foundations of Scotland's 2 most powerful underground networks were starting to crack. What had begun as a cold war between the silent Black Lock Syndicate and the brutal Dunbar Pact had escalated into a series of subtle strikes, counterattacks, and disappearances that no one could publicly trace. While law enforcement remained in the dark, the real damage was happening from within. At the center of the storm stood a man who had once been Fraser McNair's most trusted lieutenant, Camden Moss. Camden had been part of the Black Lock Syndicate since its earliest days. He wasn't particularly brilliant or violent, but he had always been loyal, efficient, and present. Fraser had kept him close for years, assigning him tasks that required discretion but never full control. Camden had access to mid-level operations, financial channels, and communication lines. But as the syndicate grew, Fraser began to rely on new, smarter operatives, often imported from outside Scotland. Camden, who had once stood at the edge of power, now found himself pushed aside. Resentment grew. Camden started siphoning small amounts of money from Fraser's narcotics deals, carefully hiding the theft through manipulated records and shell accounts. Over time, these small thefts became large embezzlements. Fraser never noticed, or so Camden thought. Emboldened by his success, he began forming his own plan to rise beyond the shadows. At the same time, in Aberdeen, the Dunbar Pact was bleeding. Police pressure had increased, and trust inside the gang was wearing thin. Callum Dunbar had grown more paranoid, striking out at anyone he suspected of betrayal. Rory had become reckless, drawing unnecessary attention through violent public acts. Isla Dunbar, the quiet mind behind the operation, was frustrated with the lack of stability and vision. Her siblings had turned a criminal empire into a war zone. And then, one day, Camden Moss reached out. Their first meeting was through a coded message. Isla was cautious, but curious. When they finally met, it was on neutral ground, an old fishing shack on the edge of the Moray Firth, known only to a few. Camden laid out his proposal. Eliminate Fraser McNair, destabilize Callum Dunbar, and combine what remained of both networks into a new syndicate, the Highland Circle. It would be a cleaner, smarter operation, rooted in strategy, not chaos or shadows. Isla, though wary, saw the opportunity. She agreed. Over the next several months, Camden and Isla launched a 2-pronged attack. Camden began leaking warehouse locations to the police, resulting in major raids on Black Lock facilities. Meanwhile, Isla fed false intelligence to Fraser's lower ranks, sowing confusion and distrust. Camden also passed anonymous tips to take down key Dunbar enforcers, blaming the attacks on rival gangs. The plan was working. Fraser's shipments were seized, his contacts arrested, and his men began to suspect each other. Callum, seeing his authority weakened by the constant losses, lashed out in all directions. Camden operated like a ghost. He made sure no one saw him with Isla, and every digital trace of their alliance was erased. He told himself this was justice, payback for years of loyalty without reward. Isla, for her part, remained cold and calculated. She kept even her brother Rory in the dark. Callum, consumed by rage and confusion, never suspected that the real traitors were the ones he never questioned. But Fraser McNair was never as blind as Camden believed. He had long known that someone inside his circle was manipulating operations. Rather than confront it immediately, Fraser watched. He allowed small losses, followed the trails, and tracked patterns. Eventually, all roads pointed back to Camden. Moss. Fraser didn't act out of emotion. He acted with precision, just as he always had. One evening, Camden vanished on his way to a supposed meeting near Perth. His body was found 3 days later, burned beyond recognition, in a stripped-down vehicle in the Highlands. No fingerprints, no documents, only a single bullet lodged in the dashboard. A quiet message for anyone else thinking of betrayal. Isla received no contact from Camden again. She knew the plan had failed. The fallout was immediate. The leaks stopped. The raids slowed, but the damage had already been done. Black Lock's infrastructure was weakened. The Dunbar Pact had lost too many men. Neither gang could return to full power. Their alliances were fractured, their territories contested, and their leaders uncertain of who could be trusted. Camden Moss had tried to build a new empire, but instead, he became the crack that split two giants in half. His betrayal did not create unity, it left a vacuum. And in the criminal underworld of Scotland, a vacuum never stays empty for long. By 2015, the landscape of Scotland's criminal underworld had shifted dramatically. The once dominant Black Lock syndicate had been gutted by betrayal and targeted raids, its founder Fraser McNair retreating further into the shadows, severing ties with anyone who could pose a threat. The Dunbar Pact, once feared across the northeast, was fractured, paranoid, and plagued by internal collapse. But the void left behind didn't remain empty. From the remnants of shattered alliances and silenced leaders, a new threat emerged. More violent, more unpredictable, and with no clear face behind it. It started in Dundee. Small-time dealers began disappearing, not just arrested or killed, but vanishing without a trace. Then, storage facilities once used by both Black Lock and the Dunbars were torched in the middle of the night. Messages were left in Gaelic, crudely painted on walls, or mailed to police stations. The phrase appeared again and again. Na H. Wesleyan, Duba, the Dark Nobles. At first, many assumed it was a myth, a scare tactic by one of the remaining gangs trying to claim dominance. But the violence that followed proved otherwise. The Dark Nobles didn't operate like previous groups. They had no identifiable leaders, no known symbols, and no consistent location. They struck without warning and vanished just as quickly. Former associates of both the Syndicate and the Dunbar Pact were hunted, interrogated, and left dead in remote forests or inside abandoned flats. Rumors spread that ex-gang members were being forced to give up hidden caches of drugs and money before being eliminated. Law enforcement was no closer to identifying the group than they had been with Fraser or the Dunbars. The few who survived an encounter spoke of heavily masked men, armed with military-grade weapons, speaking in strange codes, sometimes not even in English. What made the Dark Nobles so dangerous wasn't just their brutality, it was their unpredictability. They didn't want territory, reputation, or political influence. They wanted total erasure of the old order. Fraser McNair, now in hiding and stripped of much of his network, recognized what was happening. Someone, or some group, had studied everything he'd built and destroyed, and was now using that knowledge to wipe out all competition. He moved frequently, used burner phones, and kept no digital footprint. He still had some loyal contacts in Edinburgh, but none knew his location. For the first time, Fraser wasn't running an empire. He was simply trying to survive. In Aberdeen, The last remnants of the Dunbar Pact tried to regroup. Isla Dunbar, devastated by Camden Moss's death and the chaos that followed, began pushing for an exit from the life that had consumed her family. Her brother Rory refused. Still convinced they could rise again, he gathered a group of younger enforcers and attempted to reclaim territory in Stonehaven. The retaliation was swift and merciless. Rory's convoy was ambushed on a narrow road outside of town. No survivors. Bodies were recovered days later, unrecognizable, marked by the same cryptic signature. Na H. Wisleyan Dubha. Isla understood then that it was over. The pact was broken, the family name cursed by years of blood and betrayal. She quietly fled to mainland Europe, leaving behind the streets she once ruled. She never returned to Scotland. She never spoke to the media, and she never heard from her brother again. Police launched what they called Operation Obsidian, a nationwide task force aimed at identifying and dismantling the Dark Nobles. Despite using every resource available, they failed to make arrests. The group was like smoke, impossible to trap or trace. Crime rates in some cities fell, not because peace had returned, but because fear ruled the streets. Criminals refused to organize. Dealers abandoned supply lines. Even former gang lords went silent. Years passed, and the memory of the Blacklock Syndicate and the Dunbar Pact began to fade from public memory. Their rise and fall became whispered legends in back alleys and prison cells. But the myth of the Dark Nobles endured. No one knew who they were, where they came from, or when they would strike again. Fraser McNair was never found. Some believed he escaped to South America. Others claimed he was killed and buried in a highland peat bog. Isla Dunbar was last seen boarding a ferry from Amsterdam to Oslo, her identity masked behind false documents. No official trace of her remained after 2016. Scotland's underground empire had risen through control, collapsed under betrayal, and was ultimately buried beneath something far darker. The old gangs were gone. The streets were quiet, not with peace, but with dread. And somewhere in the silence, the Dark Nobles waited, watching, preparing. A new era had begun, forged not by loyalty or legacy, but by shadows too deep to follow.